Millionaire meets her black ex-husband after 10 years and shocks with a gesture that changes all. Sophia Edwards had spent the last decade living in a world that glittered from the outside but was hollow at its core. Her days began with meetings in glass-walled offices overlooking the Boston skyline and ended at charity galas where her name appeared beside millionaires and senators. She was the woman everyone admired, elegant, wealthy, composed. Yet behind the designer clothes and practiced smiles, there was a quiet unease, a feeling she could never fully silence. It whispered to her in hotel elevators and echoed across marble floors when she was alone. She told herself it was exhaustion, the price of success. But deep down, Sophia knew what it really was: guilt. 10 years earlier, she had walked away from another life, one that was smaller, poorer, but real. She had left behind a husband named Ethan Miller, a kind, hardworking law student who believed in things like fairness and integrity. Back then, she didn't think those qualities mattered. Love didn't pay rent. Dreams didn't buy dresses. When Charles Edwards, a charming investor twice her age, swept her off her feet, she convinced herself it was fate. Charles had money, confidence, and a plan. Ethan had only hope. So, one cold evening, Sophia packed her bags and left the small apartment they shared, leaving behind nothing but a note that said, "I can't live like this anymore." She never looked back. Or at least she told herself she didn't. Charles introduced her to a world she had only seen in magazines. Luxury cars, private dinners with politicians, and vacations that blurred together like scenes from a movie. For years, she believed she'd made the right choice. She became Mrs. Edwards, the perfect wife of a powerful man. And yet, the longer she stayed, the more cracks she noticed beneath the surface. Charles could be charming in public, but cruel in private. He dismissed people who didn't matter to him, especially people of color. At business parties, Sophia noticed the way his tone changed depending on who he spoke to, the way he called black employees loyal as if it were praise. She laughed it off, told herself it was just how the world worked. She didn't challenge him. She didn't question. Silence was easier. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share a word of love in the comments. But silence has a way of growing heavy. Over time, Sophia began to see how her life was built on the same arrogance she once ran from. The woman who mocked her husband's humble dreams had become the very thing she used to despise, someone who believed that money could erase conscience. Still, she smiled through it all, convincing herself that wealth was safety, that the guilt pressing on her chest was only nostalgia. Everything changed one afternoon when the news broke. Edwards' global investments under federal investigation. The headline flashed across every screen in the house. Sophia watched as her husband's empire crumbled in real time. Stocks plunging, assets frozen, reporters swarming outside their gate. She tried to reach Charles, but his phone was off. Within hours, she learned that her father's fortune, invested heavily in Charles's company, was also at risk. The family name that once commanded respect was now tangled in scandal. In those first few days, Sophia barely slept. She met with lawyers who spoke in riddles, advisors who stopped returning her calls, and friends who suddenly became distant. For the first time in years, her wealth couldn't buy her control. Her reflection in the mirror no longer looked powerful. It looked desperate. And as she sat in the grand living room of their mansion, surrounded by silence, she realized something terrifying. There was no one left to call. No one but him, Ethan Miller, the man she had walked out on without remorse. She found his name online: Miller and Brooks Legal, a top firm known for handling corporate corruption cases. She read his bio twice, then again, as if trying to reconcile the man in the photograph with the one she remembered. The confident smile, the tailored suit, the awards lining his office wall. This was not the struggling law student she once pitied. He had become everything she thought he'd never be. Her chest tightened as she stared at the address. It was in Boston, not far from where they had first lived together. The same city she had promised herself she'd never return to. But desperation doesn't leave room for pride. With her husband in custody and investigators circling like vultures, Sophia had no choice. The next morning, she dressed carefully, white blouse, beige coat, pearls, the kind of outfit that once made her feel untouchable. But as she stood before the mirror, something inside her shifted. For the first time, she didn't see sophistication. She saw fear. She saw the cost of every selfish choice she'd ever made. When her car pulled into that old neighborhood, the city looked different than how she remembered. The buildings were still worn, the sidewalks uneven, but there was life here. Children laughing, neighbors talking, the sound of a world that kept going even after she left. She stepped out slowly, her heels clicking against the pavement, her heart pounding in her chest. Every step toward his office felt heavier than the last. Sophia paused at the door, staring at the brass nameplate that read Miller and Brooks Legal. She felt a rush of memories. Late nights studying with Ethan, the smell of burnt coffee, the way he'd talk about justice as if it were sacred. Back then, she thought he was naive. Now, she realized he was the only one who had been right all along. She took a deep breath and reached for the handle. For the first time in her life, Sophia Edwards wasn't walking into a deal, a party, or a promise. She was walking into reckoning. And she had no idea just how much the past was waiting for her on the other side of that door. When the door opened, Sophia almost didn't recognize him. Ethan Miller stood tall, confident, his presence commanding in a way that made the air feel heavier. Gone was the soft-spoken dreamer who once shared late-night noodles and whispered plans of a better future. In his place was a man who had built that future from nothing, and done it without her. His office spoke of quiet power. Mahogany shelves lined with law journals, framed headlines about landmark corruption cases, and a single photo of him shaking hands with the U.S. Attorney General. Sophia's voice faltered as she tried to explain why she'd come. Her words tumbled out. Charles's arrest, the investigation, the frozen accounts, her father's ruined investments. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She asked for help. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. Only when she mentioned her father's name did his eyes narrow slightly, as if something had clicked. He finally nodded for her to sit. "You came to the right place," he said quietly. But something about his tone made her uneasy. It wasn't comfort, it was control. Over the next few days, she returned to his office several times, each visit unraveling more than she expected. Ethan's law partner, Olivia Brooks, was a tall, poised black woman with an intensity that filled the room. She treated Sophia with polite detachment, never cruel but never warm. When Olivia spoke, Sophia felt small. Not because Olivia was unkind, but because she carried a kind of dignity Sophia had long traded for wealth. During their meetings, Sophia noticed Olivia's sharp focus whenever Charles's company came up. She handled folders marked Edwards Global Investments with a precision that made Sophia's stomach twist. Something about the way Olivia's eyes lingered on her name made Sophia feel exposed, as if this investigation had roots deeper than she realized. It wasn't until a week later that she learned the truth. While reviewing some documents Ethan had prepared, Sophia saw a report stamped with the Justice Department's seal. Buried inside was a line that stopped her cold. Primary testimony provided by Ethan Miller, co-counsel Olivia Brooks. Her pulse quickened. These weren't new documents. This case had been building for years. She turned toward Ethan, her voice trembling. "You've been investigating Charles this whole time." Ethan didn't deny it. He leaned back in his chair, calm, collected. "Yes, for 6 years." The room seemed to shrink around her. You built the case that destroyed him." Ethan met her gaze. "I built the case that exposed him." His tone was even, but beneath it was a quiet storm. "You think I wanted this? I didn't. But men like Charles don't just steal money. They steal lives." He explained how it started, with a whistleblower named Michael Carter. an engineer who discovered chemical waste being dumped into two small towns to cut costs. The contamination poisoned dozens of children. Michael tried to go public, but Charles Edwards had him fired, blacklisted, and silenced. 6 months later, Michael was found dead in what was labeled a car accident. But Olivia Brooks knew better. Michael was her cousin. Sophia's chest tightened as Ethan continued. The firm had spent years gathering evidence, connecting accounts, tracing bribes. Every thread led back to Charles. "We didn't go after him because he was rich," Ethan said quietly. "We went after him because he believed no one would stop him. He thought power made him untouchable." Sophia could barely breathe. The man she'd defended, the husband she'd trusted, had built his empire on destruction. And the person who brought him down, the one she had once left for being too poor, was now the one protecting justice. But before she could process it all, her phone began to ring. The name flashing on the screen made her freeze. Charles, calling from federal custody. Ethan gave her a nod to answer, and Olivia discreetly turned on a recording device. Charles's voice crackled through the speaker, his tone sharp and mocking. He demanded to know if she'd gone crawling back to her loser ex-husband. He laughed when she didn't reply. "You think this changes anything, Sophia? That man will always be beneath us." Ethan didn't react. He simply leaned forward, eyes steady, and said, "Then why are you calling from a federal prison, Charles?" The silence that followed was electric. Then came the fatal mistake. In his rage, Charles blurted out something he could never take back, admitting that the secret offshore accounts were all registered under Sophia's name. "I had to protect myself," he said bitterly. "If things went wrong, you'd take the fall." Sophia's blood ran cold. Her knees weakened. He had used her as a shield. All her luxury, all her loyalty, nothing but a disguise for his greed. Ethan ended the call with one line that cut through the room. "Thank you, Charles." The FBI was listening. The line went dead, and Sophia collapsed into a chair, trembling. Olivia stopped the recording and quietly left the room to hand it over to the agents waiting downstairs. Sophia looked at Ethan through tears. "You knew this would happen." "I knew he'd expose himself," he said. "Men like Charles always do. They think they can't lose." The weight of his words pressed down on her. For the first time, she saw the full picture. Not just of Charles's crimes, but of her own complicity. She had walked away from a man who fought for justice, only to marry one who destroyed it. That night, as she drove back to what remained of her mansion, the city lights blurred through her tears. Every mile brought another realization. She wasn't just a victim of Charles's schemes. She had helped build the illusion that made them possible. But redemption, Ethan once told her long ago, isn't found in apologies. It's found in truth. And as dawn crept over Boston, Sophia made a choice. She would testify, not for Charles, not for her father's name, but for every life destroyed by their greed. What she didn't know was that her decision would set off a chain reaction no one could stop. Justice was coming, but it wouldn't come gently. The courtroom was silent except for the rhythmic tapping of the judge's pen. Sophia sat at the witness stand, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Every camera in the room pointed at her, capturing the woman who had once dined with senators and CEOs, now testifying against her own husband. Behind the polished wood and marble walls, the world was watching the fall of the Edwards empire. Across the aisle, Charles sat in his tailored prison suit. His once proud posture slumped under the weight of what he'd done. But even now, his eyes burned with defiance. He didn't look at the jury or the judge. He stared at Sophia. A silent accusation. A dare. Ethan sat a few rows back, his face steady but unreadable. Olivia Brooks was beside him, her arms crossed, eyes sharp. To the world, they were the prosecutors who brought down one of Boston's most corrupt businessmen. But to Sophia, they were something else entirely, mirrors of what integrity looked like when it refused to bow. The prosecutor's voice echoed, Mrs. Edwards, can you confirm that the accounts listed under your name were created without your consent? Sophia's throat tightened. She forced herself to look at the screen showing rows of bank statements, her signature forged, her identity weaponized. Yes, she said quietly. I did not know of them. Charles smirked. The expression she once found charming now felt monstrous. The defense attorney leaned forward. Mrs. Edwards, isn't it true that you enjoyed the benefits of these funds for years? Lavish homes, private jets, luxury events. Every eye turned to her. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. They weren't just questioning her, they were judging her. The rich white woman who married for status and pretended not to see the destruction left behind. Ethan's voice broke through the noise in her memory. The words he'd once said about justice, about courage. She straightened her back. Yes, she said, louder this time. I lived in comfort. I turned away from what I didn't want to see. But that doesn't mean I knew how deep the lies went. I was blind because I chose to be. And that's why I'm here, to make it right. A ripple moved through the courtroom. It wasn't redemption yet, but it was truth, and truth had weight. As the trial continued, evidence mounted. Contracts, emails, and recordings. The corruption stretched far beyond money. It exposed racial injustice buried beneath corporate polish. Charles's company had targeted predominantly black neighborhoods for industrial projects, hiding pollution and falsifying safety reports. Children had fallen sick, families had been displaced, all for profit. And Sophia, sitting there under oath, saw the full extent of what her silence had cost. One witness after another took the stand. Workers, parents, community leaders, each voice painting a clearer picture of exploitation. Olivia handled each testimony with grace but steel. When she introduced the evidence of Michael Carter's whistleblower reports, the courtroom fell into complete silence. This is what integrity looks like, Olivia said firmly, her voice carrying across the room. It's the voice that speaks even when it knows it may be silenced. Sophia's eyes filled as she realized the full circle of it all. The man she married had destroyed lives without hesitation. The man she abandoned had spent years fighting for those very lives. Then came the final blow. The prosecution played the recorded call. Charles's voice admitting that the $27 million in offshore accounts were under Sophia's name. The same call Ethan had captured weeks earlier. The room crackled with tension. Charles jumped to his feet, shouting, "You set me up! You and that woman!" He pointed toward Ethan and Olivia, his voice raw with fury. "You think you can ruin me because I did business my way?" The judge banged his gavel, demanding silence. But Charles kept yelling. "This is what you wanted, isn't it, Sophia? You think these people care about you? You're their pawn now." His words sliced through her, but they didn't break her. For years, she had lived in fear of that voice, bending to its power. Now, for the first time, she felt free of it. She turned toward him slowly, her voice steady. "No, Charles, I'm not anyone's pawn. I'm finally telling the truth." The courtroom erupted as the judge called for order. The jury watched closely, eyes fixed on the fallen millionaire who had tried to twist his guilt into someone else's shame. When the verdict was read, the silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Guilty on all counts: corporate fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and environmental violations. Charles's jaw clenched. For a moment he turned to Sophia, his eyes filled not with regret, but with hatred, the kind that comes from losing control. Two marshals stepped forward to escort him out. He hesitated just long enough to spit out, "You'll regret this." But Sophia didn't flinch. Not this time. As Charles was led away, reporters swarmed outside the courthouse, shouting questions, cameras flashing. Sophia didn't answer any of them. She walked down those marble steps with her head held high, though her heart felt heavy with everything she'd lost and everything she'd learned. Inside, Ethan stood watching her from the doorway. Olivia was beside him, her arms crossed, eyes softened with something close to respect. They didn't need to say anything. The look between them said it all. Justice had come, but it had come at a cost. That evening, as rain began to fall over the city, Sophia sat in her car, staring out at the courthouse lights reflecting in the puddles. She thought about Michael Carter, about the families who suffered, about the years she wasted chasing the wrong kind of power. And then, for the first time in a long while, she whispered a quiet promise to herself, to live differently, to do something that mattered. But justice doesn't end with a verdict. And as the storm rolled over Boston that night, Sophia had no idea that the hardest part, the rebuilding, was only just beginning. 2 years had passed since the verdict, yet the echoes of that courtroom still followed Sophia wherever she went. The scandal that once made her a social pariah had slowly transformed into something else, an awakening. The newspapers that once called her the fallen wife of a disgraced millionaire now spoke of her as the founder of the Carter Initiative, an organization dedicated to supporting victims of corporate corruption and environmental injustice. Named in honor of Michael Carter, the man whose voice had been silenced, her foundation worked in neighborhoods that had been ignored for decades. Sophia no longer lived in marble halls or hosted charity galas. Her office was small, tucked between 2 old brick buildings in Roxbury, a place she had once driven past without seeing. The walls were covered not in designer art but in photographs. Children smiling in newly restored parks, families who had won settlements against corrupt industries, communities rebuilding after years of neglect. Every morning, she arrived early, carrying coffee for her staff. Sometimes, she'd stand by the window, watching the sun rise over the city she'd once abandoned. Boston looked different now, not because the streets had changed, but because she had. Ethan Miller had changed, too. He had stepped away from daily litigation to serve as a senior advisor to the Department of Justice. His work helped shape new federal reforms on corporate transparency and racial accountability, laws designed to prevent exactly the kind of injustice Charles Edwards had built his empire on. And though he rarely appeared in the media, his name had become a symbol of integrity, especially within minority legal circles where young attorneys looked to him as proof that doing the right thing could still lead to success. Their paths crossed again one spring morning. Sophia had been invited to speak at a policy conference on ethical reform. As she stepped into the grand chamber, she saw him at the podium, calm, confident, addressing a hall filled with lawmakers, journalists, and activists. His voice carried not anger, but conviction. "When power is unchecked," he said, "the ones who suffer most are those who already have the least. Justice must not only punish corruption, it must protect the communities that power forgets." When his speech ended, the crowd stood in applause. Sophia sat quietly in the front row, her heart heavy but full. She wasn't there for recognition. She was there to bear witness to the man she once underestimated and the cause she had learned to fight for. After the session, their eyes met. He approached her with that same calm composure she'd come to recognize. There were no harsh words, no reminders of the past. Just mutual understanding, 2 people shaped by choices, pain, and time. "You did good work," he said simply. Sophia smiled faintly. "You gave me the chance to." They stood there for a moment, silent amid the noise of cameras and conversation. For the first time, Sophia didn't feel guilt when she looked at him. She felt gratitude and something deeper, the kind of respect that comes from knowing you've both walked through fire and come out changed. Later that evening, Sophia returned to her small office. On her desk sat a letter from a mother in Detroit, thanking the Carter Initiative for helping her win a lawsuit against a chemical plant that had poisoned her neighborhood's water. The woman's words were simple. "You gave us back our voice." Sophia read it twice, her vision blurring with tears. She thought about Olivia Brooks and the quiet power of her persistence. She thought about Michael Carter, whose courage had sparked the first light of truth. And she thought about Ethan, the man who had once been dismissed for his poverty and race, who had risen not through vengeance, but through conviction. Sophia knew she couldn't erase her past, but she could honor what it had taught her. That silence in the face of injustice is a form of complicity, and that privilege means nothing if it isn't used to lift others. Outside, rain began to fall again, the same soft, steady rain that had poured on the day of Charles's sentencing. She stood by the window listening to it, remembering the woman she used to be and the woman she had become. The world hadn't changed overnight. Racism still lingered in boardrooms, in laws, in whispers that went unchallenged. But she had learned something powerful. That change doesn't start with grand gestures or courtroom victories. It starts when one person decides to stop looking away. As the lights of the city flickered below, Sophia whispered a quiet truth that she hoped others would hear, too. We can't undo the past, but we can refuse to repeat it. And maybe that's what justice really is, not revenge, not redemption, but responsibility. The courage to face the truth and the will to do better next time. So, as you sit here listening to this story, ask yourself, how many times have you looked away? How many voices have gone unheard because comfort felt easier than conscience? Maybe the real gesture that changes everything isn't wealth or power. It's choosing to see what others refuse to. And sometimes that choice is where true justice begins. What did you think of Sophia's story? Do you believe people like her can truly change? Or are some mistakes too heavy to ever make right? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We share stories that evoke emotions, stories that remind us of the power of empathy. Your support helps us keep telling them. So hit that like button, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next story.